The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the desert silence like a blade through silk. Overwatch, this is Phantom 6-1. We have eyes on the compound. Multiple tangos, heavy fortification. Request permission to engage. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, leading a 12-man Navy SEAL team deep in the mountains of Afghanistan. What Morrison didn't know was that somewhere in the darkness above, a pair of eyes watched through night vision, finger poised over a trigger that would change everything. The mission had started like any other, intelligence suggesting a high-value target hiding in a remote Taliban stronghold. The kind of operation the SEALs had run hundreds of times before. But as Morrison's team approached the ridge overlooking the compound, something felt different. The air was too still, the silence too complete. Even the insects had stopped their nighttime chorus, as if nature itself sensed the approaching storm. Phantom 6-1, you are cleared hot. Proceed with caution, came the response from Base Command, transmitted through encrypted channels that bounced off satellites spinning 22,000 miles above the Hindu Kush Mountains. Morrison signaled his team forward, their boots finding purchase on the rocky terrain with practiced silence. These were America's elite warriors, men who had trained for years to become shadows in the night, ghosts who could appear and vanish without a trace. But tonight, they weren't alone in the darkness. From her concealed position 800 meters away, Captain Alexis Reaper Volkov adjusted her scope's focus, her breathing steady and controlled. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle felt like an extension of her body, its weight familiar after countless hours of training and real-world operations. She'd been tracking this Taliban cell for 3 weeks, moving through the mountains like smoke, invisible to both friend and foe. Her mission was simple: gather intelligence and report back. Under no circumstances was she to engage unless directly threatened. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very people she was sent to observe were now walking into what looked like a carefully orchestrated trap. Through her thermal scope, she could see the heat signatures of at least 30 enemy combatants positioned throughout the compound, far more than intelligence had suggested. The SEALs were walking into a killing field, and they had no idea. Morrison's team reached the outer perimeter, their movements fluid and coordinated. Years of training had turned them into a single organism, each man knowing instinctively where the others would be, what they would do. But all the training in the world couldn't prepare them for what was waiting in those ancient stone buildings, carved from the mountain itself centuries ago by hands long turned to dust. The first shot rang out at exactly 3:52 hours, shattering the silence like glass. Morrison dove for cover behind a low stone wall, his heart hammering against his ribs as bullets whined overhead. The muzzle flashes erupted from every window, every doorway, every conceivable firing position. His team scattered, seeking whatever cover they could find in the barren landscape. The intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. This wasn't a hideout for a single high-value target. This was a fortress, and they were massively outnumbered. Contact, contact, multiple shooters. Morrison barked into his radio, pressing himself flat against the ancient stones as rounds sparked off the rocks inches from his head. We're taking heavy fire from all directions. Request immediate air support. The response came back filled with static and frustration. Phantom 6-1, air support is 20 minutes out. Can you hold position? 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Morrison could hear his teammates calling out positions, ammunition counts, casualty reports. Sergeant Rodriguez had taken shrapnel to his left arm but was still fighting. Corporal Jenkins was pinned down behind a boulder 50 meters to the east, running low on ammunition. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Morrison could feel the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain. That's when the impossible happened. The first Taliban fighter dropped silently, his rifle clattering down the stone steps of the compound's main building. Then another, then a third. Each shot came from somewhere in the darkness beyond the compound, precise and deadly. Morrison couldn't see the muzzle flashes, couldn't identify the shooter's position. But one by one, The enemy fire began to slacken as unseen bullets found their marks with surgical precision. "What the hell is going on out there?" Morrison whispered into his radio, but his teammates were equally bewildered. Someone was out there in the night, someone who could shoot like the hand of God himself, picking off Taliban fighters with methodical efficiency. The unknown marksman was evening the odds, giving the SEALs a fighting chance. High above on her rocky perch, Reaper worked the bolt of her rifle with mechanical precision, ejecting spent brass that tinkled against the stones before disappearing into the darkness. Each shot was calculated, measured, inevitable. She'd thrown away her orders the moment she'd seen the SEALs walking into the trap. Sometimes being a good soldier meant being a bad soldier. Her scope found another target, a bearded fighter with an RPG, positioning himself to devastate what remained of the SEAL team. The crosshairs settled on his chest, and Reaper's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot echoed across the mountains like thunder, and another enemy fighter crumpled to the ground. The RPG rolled harmlessly down the rocky slope, its deadly payload unfired. Morrison's team was still in mortal danger, but now they had a guardian angel watching over them from the darkness. Someone who shot like legend and moved like smoke. Someone who would disappear into the night before anyone could ask her name. Morrison's radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different. Female, calm, professional. Phantom 6-1, this is unknown call sign. You have approximately 15 tangos remaining, concentrated in the main building. I have overwatch from your 6 o'clock. Move to the rally point at grid reference 774992. I'll provide cover. Morrison looked at his sergeant with raised eyebrows. Who the hell is that? Don't know, sir, but I'm not arguing with someone who shoots like that. The SEAL team began their fighting withdrawal, leapfrogging from cover to cover while their mysterious benefactor continued to thin the enemy ranks. Each shot was perfect, each kill instantaneous. Morrison had worked with Marine snipers, Army Rangers, even Delta Force operators, but he'd never seen shooting like this. Whoever was up there in the darkness wasn't just good, they were supernatural. The compound erupted in flames as the Taliban fighters began firing wildly into the night, trying to locate their tormentor. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, but the unknown sniper remained invisible, a phantom dispensing justice from the shadows. The enemy's panic was palpable now, their disciplined defense dissolving into chaos as their numbers continued to dwindle. Morrison's team reached the rally point, a cluster of boulders that provided decent cover and concealment. The lieutenant commander keyed his radio again. Unknown call sign, this is Phantom 6-1. We're at the rally point. Can you identify yourself? There was a long pause before the response came, tinged with what might have been amusement. That's not how this works, Navy. Just keep your heads down and let me work. As the firefight continued, Morrison found himself studying the pattern of the shots, trying to understand the tactical mind behind them. The unknown sniper wasn't just killing randomly. They were systematically dismantling the Taliban's defensive positions, eliminating key personnel and weapons in a specific order that maximized the impact on enemy morale and capabilities. This wasn't just marksmanship. This was artistry. The sound of rotors began to echo off the mountain peaks, growing stronger by the minute. Air support was finally arriving, but by the time the Apache helicopters reached the battlefield, there might not be any targets left for them to engage. The mysterious guardian angel was methodically erasing the threat, one perfectly placed bullet at a time. From her position, Reaper could see the Apache helicopters approaching like mechanical vultures against the star-filled sky. Their thermal imaging would be scanning the battlefield, trying to make sense of the carnage below. She'd have to be gone soon, before someone started asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Her ammunition was running low anyway. She'd packed for a reconnaissance mission, not a full-scale engagement. But there were still 3 Taliban fighters holed up in the main building, and they had a clear line of sight to the SEAL team's position. Reaper adjusted her scope one final time, taking careful aim at the window where she'd seen muzzle flashes. The range was extreme, nearly 1,000 meters, and the wind had picked up, but she'd made tougher shots under worse conditions. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and another enemy fighter toppled backward into the darkness of the building. 2 left. Morrison watched in amazement as the firefight wound down to sporadic shots, and then silence. In less than 30 minutes, an unknown sniper had turned a potential massacre into a tactical victory. The Taliban fighters who weren't dead had apparently fled into the deeper parts of the mountain complex, abandoning their positions and leaving behind weapons and equipment in their haste to escape. Phantom 6-1, this is Apache 2-7. We're on station and ready to engage, came the voice of the attack helicopter pilot, his aircraft now circling overhead like a mechanical bird of prey. Apache 2-7, targets have been neutralized. Unknown friendly has cleared the objective, Morrison replied, still scanning the darkness for any sign of their mysterious savior. The radio remained silent for a long moment before the Apache pilot responded. Roger that, Phantom 6-1. We're showing minimal heat signatures in the compound. Appears to be effective. But when Morrison tried to raise their guardian angel again, there was no response. The unknown call sign had vanished into the night as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only empty brass casings and a pile of dead Taliban fighters. The Apache helicopters continued their patrol while Morrison's team secured the compound, but their mysterious benefactor was gone. Not even the helicopter's sophisticated thermal imaging could detect so much as a heat signature where the shots had come from. It was as if their savior had simply materialized from the darkness, dispensed justice, and melted back into the night like smoke. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Morrison found himself staring up at the rocky outcropping where he calculated the shots had originated. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there, no spent casings, no disturbed earth, no evidence of human presence. If not for the dead Taliban fighters scattered throughout the compound, he might have believed he'd imagined the entire encounter. "Sir, you need to see this," called Sergeant Rodriguez from inside the main building. Morrison made his way through the debris and bodies to where his sergeant was examining what appeared to be detailed intelligence documents spread across a wooden table. The papers were covered in Arabic script, but the maps and diagrams told a clear story. This hadn't been a random hideout. It had been a planning center for a major attack on coalition forces. Vehicle routes, guard rotations, equipment manifests, personnel files. The Taliban had been preparing something big, and the SEAL team had stumbled into it by accident. "Jesus," Morrison whispered, studying the documents, "if they'd pulled this off." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Would have been a bloodbath, sir. Looks like our guardian angel didn't just save our asses, they might have saved a lot of people." Morrison gathered the intelligence documents and prepared them for transport back to base. As his team loaded their gear and prepared for extraction, he found himself looking up at the mountain one more time. Somewhere out there was someone who had risked everything to save strangers, someone who possessed skills that bordered on the supernatural. Someone who had chosen to remain anonymous, disappearing into legend. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, lifting Morrison's team away from the battlefield as the sun climbed higher into the crystalline mountain air. As they flew over the rocky terrain, Morrison pressed his face to the window, still searching for any sign of their mysterious protector. But the mountains kept their secrets, as they had for thousands of years. Back at base, the debriefing was unlike anything Morrison had ever experienced. Intelligence officers pored over the captured documents, while operations personnel tried to make sense of the tactical situation. The official report would state that the SEAL team had successfully completed their mission, with the assistance of an unidentified coalition sniper. But Morrison knew that phrase didn't capture the reality of what had happened in those mountains. Someone had saved their lives, then vanished like a ghost. Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, studied Morrison's after-action report with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Lieutenant Commander, you're absolutely certain about the number of confirmed kills attributed to this unknown sniper? Yes, sir. 27 confirmed, possibly more. Precision shooting at ranges exceeding 800 meters in low-light conditions. I've never seen anything like it. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. He'd been fighting wars for over 2 decades, had seen everything the battlefield had to offer. But this was something new, something that didn't fit into any operational paradigm he knew. Any idea who it might have been? Special Operations Command doesn't have anyone operating in that sector. CIA says it wasn't one of theirs. The Brits and Germans are accounted for. Morrison shook his head. Whoever it was, sir, they saved our lives. And from the intelligence we recovered, they probably saved a lot more than that. As the days turned into weeks, the story of the unknown sniper began to spread through the military community like wildfire. Special operations personnel shared whispered conversations about the phantom marksman who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Some claimed it was an urban legend, a story that grew in the telling. Others swore they'd encountered similar mysterious assistants during their own operations. But for Reaper, now 300 miles away and operating under a different identity, the mission had become personal in a way she hadn't expected. She'd broken her orders, revealed her position, and risked her life for a group of strangers. It went against everything she'd been taught about covert operations. And yet, she'd never been more certain that she'd done the right thing. The intelligence documents recovered from the compound had revealed a network of Taliban cells planning coordinated attacks across the region. Coalition forces were now moving to disrupt those plans, guided by the information Morrison's team had captured. Lives would be saved because of what had happened in those mountains, because one sniper had chosen to act rather than observe. Colonel Harrison called Morrison into his office 3 weeks after the mission. The younger officer expected another debriefing, another attempt to identify their mysterious savior. Instead, he found the colonel studying a classified message on his computer screen, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Commander, I've just received word from Special Operations Command. They're very interested in your report about the unknown sniper. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Sir, it seems your ghost has struck again. Different sector, different unit, same result. A Marine recon team was about to be overrun near the Pakistani border when an unknown sniper provided precision support from an unidentified position. 17 confirmed kills, perfect tactical execution, disappeared without a trace. The colonel turned his monitor so Morrison could see the operational report. The details were eerily similar. An outnumbered American unit facing overwhelming odds, precise sniper fire from an unknown location, enemy forces neutralized with surgical efficiency. Sir, do we have any idea who this person is? Harrison's smile was thin and enigmatic. That's classified above your pay grade, son, but I will say this, whoever they are, they're on our side, and that's all you need to know. Morrison left the colonel's office with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense of respect for their mysterious guardian. Somewhere in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, someone was waging a private war against America's enemies. Someone with skills that defied explanation and a moral compass that pointed true north. Someone who had chosen to become legend rather than seek recognition. The legend continued to grow with each passing month. Special operations units began reporting similar encounters, a mysterious sniper appearing at crucial moments, providing precisely the support needed to turn desperate situations into victories. The shots were always perfect, the tactical judgment flawless, the disappearance complete. Military analysts tried to piece together a pattern, to identify the phantom warrior who seemed to appear wherever American forces needed help most. But their efforts were frustrated by a complete lack of physical evidence. No spent casings left behind, no footprints, no DNA traces. It was as if their savior existed in the spaces between reality and myth. Some theorists suggested it was multiple snipers working in coordination, a secret unit operating beyond official channels. Others believed it was a single individual with access to resources and intelligence that suggested government backing. A few whispered that it might be someone who had gone rogue, a military asset operating without authorization or oversight. But in the forward operating bases and remote outposts where American soldiers fought and died far from home, the debates about identity mattered less than results. The phantom sniper had become something more than human, a guardian spirit watching over America's warriors, striking down their enemies with divine precision. For Reaper, watching the legend of her alter ego grow from the shadows, the irony was bittersweet. She'd spent her entire career fighting for recognition, struggling against a military culture that questioned whether a woman could be as effective in combat as her male counterparts. Now she was becoming famous for actions she could never claim credit for. But fame had never been the point. The point was protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, using her skills to save lives rather than simply take them. Each mission reinforced her belief that some things were more important than career advancement or official recognition. The war in Afghanistan was changing, winding down as political pressures mounted back home. Coalition forces were beginning to withdraw, leaving behind a country still torn by conflict, but hopefully better than they'd found it. For many soldiers, the end of their deployment couldn't come soon enough. But for Reaper, the approaching conclusion of official operations meant difficult choices about her future. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Reaper's official commanding officer, had been tracking her subordinates' activities with growing concern. As the officer responsible for several deep-cover operatives in the theater, Mitchell had access to intelligence reports that painted a troubling picture. One of her people was operating outside established parameters, engaging in unauthorized combat operations. The problem was that those unauthorized operations were proving remarkably effective at supporting American interests in the region. Taliban cells were being disrupted, planned attacks were being foiled, and American lives were being saved. It was exactly the kind of results that Mitchell's superiors wanted to see, even if the methods were irregular. But irregular methods had a way of creating irregular consequences. Mitchell opened the secure satellite link to Reaper's handler, a CIA operative known only as Control, who managed assets throughout the region. The conversation that followed would determine whether Reaper's war was ending or just beginning. Control, we need to discuss Asset 77. Her activities have expanded beyond mission parameters. The electronic voice that responded was carefully neutral. Asset 77 has been delivering exceptional results. Her intelligence reports have been invaluable. Intelligence reports aren't the issue. It's the direct action missions she's undertaking without authorization. She's becoming visible Control. People are starting to ask questions. There was a long pause before Control responded. Sometimes visibility serves a purpose, Colonel. Sometimes legends accomplish things that official operations cannot. Mitchell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in her secure communications center. She'd been in the intelligence business long enough to recognize when larger forces were at work, when individual assets became pieces in games played at levels far above her clearance. Are you telling me this has approval from higher authority? I'm telling you that Asset 77 should continue her current mission profile until instructed otherwise. Her work is appreciated by people who matter. The connection terminated, leaving Mitchell staring at a blank screen and wrestling with implications she didn't fully understand. Her operative had apparently become something more than just another intelligence asset. She'd become a weapon in someone else's war, a phantom warrior whose legend was being carefully cultivated for purposes Mitchell could only guess at. In the mountains of Afghanistan, Reaper felt the weight of observation pressing down on her like the desert sun. She'd been operating independently for months, following her own tactical judgment rather than waiting for orders from handlers who couldn't see the ground truth of each situation. But independence came with costs, and she was beginning to sense that those costs were accumulating. Her equipment cache was hidden in a cave system that had probably sheltered warriors for centuries before her arrival. Ancient stone walls bore the marks of previous conflicts, bullet holes from Soviet weapons, scorch marks from British artillery, perhaps even blade scratches from Alexander's soldiers. History had a long memory in these mountains, and violence was just another form of erosion, slowly wearing away at stone and flesh with equal patience. The Barrett rifle lay disassembled on a rocky ledge, its components cleaned and oiled with the devotion of a religious ritual. This weapon had become an extension of her will, a tool for imposing order on chaos. Through its scope, she'd seen into the hearts of evil men and found them wanting. Each shot had been a judgment rendered and executed simultaneously. But judgment was a burden as much as a power, and Reaper could feel the weight of all those decisions accumulating like scar tissue around her soul. Each life she'd taken had been necessary, justified, righteous. But necessity didn't eliminate consequence, and righteousness didn't erase memory. Her radio crackled to life, interrupting her maintenance routine. Asset 77, this is Control, priority message. Reaper keyed her microphone, her voice professionally neutral. Go ahead, Control. You have a new tasking. High-value target, time-sensitive. Coordinates follow. The mission details that followed were unlike anything she'd received before. Instead of reconnaissance or intelligence gathering, this was pure direct action. A Taliban commander who'd been orchestrating attacks on coalition forces throughout the region would be traveling through a specific valley in 48 hours. Weather conditions would limit air support options. Satellite coverage would be intermittent. It was a perfect mission for a phantom sniper. But as Reaper studied the intelligence package, she began to notice details that didn't quite fit. The target's travel route seemed almost deliberately designed to take him through areas where a sniper would have optimal fields of fire. The timing coincided with a period when conventional forces would be out of position to respond. Even the weather forecast seemed suspiciously convenient. Someone wanted this Taliban commander dead, and they wanted it to happen in a way that couldn't be traced back to official channels. They wanted it to happen in a way that would add to the legend of the Phantom Sniper, reinforcing the psychological impact of her reputation. Reaper felt a familiar chill as she realized she was no longer just conducting unauthorized missions. She was being used as an unofficial asset by someone with access to high-level intelligence and operational planning. Her rebellion had been co-opted, her independence transformed into a different kind of leash. But the target was legitimate and American lives were at stake. Whatever games were being played at higher levels, the ground truth remained simple. Evil men needed to be stopped, and she was in a position to stop them. She began packing her equipment, preparing for what might be her last mission as the Phantom of the Hindu Kush. The valley stretched out below like a moonlit amphitheater, its ancient stones bearing witness to countless battles fought by warriors whose names had long since been forgotten by history. Reaper had positioned herself on a rocky outcrop that provided clear sight lines across multiple potential routes, her rifle steady on its bipod as she waited for her target to appear. According to intelligence, the Taliban commander would be traveling with a small security detail, probably in nondescript civilian vehicles, to avoid attention from coalition air assets. He was reportedly heading for a meeting with other insurgent leaders, carrying plans for coordinated attacks on American positions throughout the region. Through her scope, Reaper could see the entire valley spread out like a tactical map. Every rock, every shadow, every potential avenue of approach was cataloged in her mind. She'd been watching for 3 hours, her patience honed by years of training and months of real-world experience. At 2:30 hours, she spotted vehicle lights moving along the valley floor, following the ancient caravan route that had connected civilizations for thousands of years. Two pickup trucks, moving at moderate speed, their occupants probably scanning for threats from the air rather than the ground. Reaper adjusted her scope and began her final preparations. Range to target 640 meters, wind speed negligible, temperature steady. All conditions were optimal for precision shooting. But as she watched the vehicles approach, something nagged at her tactical instincts. The security detail was too small, too casual. For a high-value target carrying sensitive intelligence, this looked more like a routine transportation mission than a critical operational movement. Her finger moved to the trigger, but she hesitated. Years of training screamed at her to take the shot, to eliminate a legitimate military target who posed a direct threat to American forces. But months of operating in the shadows had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this mission felt wrong. The lead vehicle stopped directly beneath her position, its occupants climbing out to examine what appeared to be mechanical trouble. In the green glow of her night vision scope, Reaper could see their faces clearly. Young men, barely out of their teens, carrying weapons with the casual familiarity of people who'd grown up in a war zone. But they weren't scanning for threats with the disciplined alertness of experienced fighters. They were laughing, joking, behaving like civilians rather than hardened insurgents. One of them lit a cigarette, the orange glow clearly visible against the darkness. Professional soldiers didn't smoke in hostile territory where snipers might be watching. Reaper felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. These weren't Taliban commanders carrying operational intelligence. They were decoys, probably local civilians paid to drive a specific route at a specific time, unknowing participants in someone else's elaborate game. Someone had fed her false intelligence, knowing she would respond with lethal force. Someone wanted her to kill innocent people while believing she was eliminating legitimate threats. The question was whether this was incompetence or malice, whether she was being manipulated by allies or enemies. Her finger moved away from the trigger as she reassessed the entire tactical situation. If these were decoys, then the real question was who had positioned them here and why. The answer to that question would determine whether she was still fighting for the right side or had become an unwitting tool of something darker. The vehicles resumed their journey after a few minutes, their occupants apparently having resolved their mechanical issues. Reaper watched them disappear into the night, her weapon unfired but her mind racing through the implications of what she'd almost done. Someone had tried to turn her into a war criminal, and she'd been seconds away from falling into the trap. Her radio remained silent as she packed her equipment and prepared to leave the valley. Control would be expecting a mission report, confirmation that the target had been eliminated. Instead, they would receive questions that might prove more dangerous than any answers. As dawn broke over the Hindu Kush, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, Reaper began her journey back to base camp. But she was no longer the same person who had entered these mountains months ago. The phantom sniper who had saved American lives and struck fear into enemy hearts had discovered that the true enemy might be wearing the same uniform she was. The game had changed, and she needed to understand the new rules before she could decide how to play. Colonel Mitchell was waiting in the secure communications center when Reaper finally made contact, 48 hours after her missed check-in. The delay was operationally significant. Assets who missed scheduled contacts were either compromised, captured, or dead. In Reaper's case, the silence had been a choice rather than a circumstance. Asset 77 report. Mitchell's voice was carefully controlled, but Reaper could detect the underlying tension. "Mission parameters were inaccurate," Reaper replied, her own voice flat and professional. "Target assessment did not match intelligence briefing. No engagement occurred." There was a long pause before Mitchell responded. "Explain." Intelligence suggested high-value target with security detail. Visual confirmation showed civilian vehicles with non-combatant occupants. Request clarification of source reliability. Another pause, this one longer than the first. Reaper could almost hear the colonel's mind working through the implications. Either the intelligence had been wrong, which suggested serious problems with their sources, or it had been deliberately false, which suggested problems that went far beyond operational security. "Stand by for new tasking," Mitchell finally said. "Return to base for debriefing." The connection terminated, leaving Reaper staring at her radio with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Returning to base meant answering questions she might not want to answer, explaining decisions that might be difficult to justify. It also meant discovering whether her suspicions about being manipulated were accurate or paranoid. But staying in the field indefinitely wasn't an option either. Her supplies were running low, her equipment needed maintenance, and her position was becoming increasingly precarious as coalition forces prepared for final withdrawal from the region. She began the long journey back to base camp, moving through terrain that had become as familiar as her childhood neighborhood. Every ridge, every valley, every potential sniper position was cataloged in her memory. These mountains had become her kingdom, and she was about to abdicate her throne. The base camp had changed during her absence, its population swelling with personnel and equipment preparing for the final phases of the withdrawal. Helicopters landed and took off with mechanical regularity, ferrying people and materials to transportation hubs that would eventually carry them home. The war was ending, at least officially. Reaper approached the main gate wearing civilian clothes and carrying identification that would pass casual inspection, but wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny. Her official identity had been carefully constructed to provide operational cover while maintaining plausible deniability for her superiors. She was a ghost in more ways than one. Security personnel waved her through after a brief document check, their attention focused on more obvious threats than a lone woman carrying a small backpack. Inside the perimeter, she made her way to the intelligence compound, a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by additional security measures and electronic countermeasures. Colonel Mitchell was waiting in a windowless conference room that smelled of recycled air and industrial disinfectant. The older woman studied Reaper with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Sit down, Captain," Mitchell said, using Reaper's official rank for the first time in months. "We need to discuss your recent activities." Reaper took the offered chair but remained alert, her hands resting casually on the table where they could move quickly if necessary. Years of operating behind enemy lines had taught her that interrogation rooms could become prisons with very little warning. "Before we begin," Mitchell continued, "I want you to know that your work has been exceptional. The intelligence you've gathered and the operations you've conducted have saved American lives and advanced our strategic objectives in the region." The praise felt like a trap, but Reaper simply nodded and waited for the colonel to continue. "However, your methods have become irregular, operating outside established parameters, engaging in unauthorized direct action, maintaining communication silence during critical periods. These behaviors are concerning from an operational security standpoint." Reaper chose her words carefully. "Ma'am, ground conditions often require tactical flexibility. Rigid adherence to predetermined parameters can compromise mission effectiveness." Mitchell's smile was thin and knowing. "That's exactly what I expected you to say, and it's exactly what makes you so valuable for certain types of operations." The conversation was moving in directions that Reaper hadn't anticipated, suggesting possibilities that made her deeply uncomfortable. She'd expected disciplinary action, reassignment, perhaps even court-martial proceedings. Instead, she was receiving what sounded like recruitment for something else entirely. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "Captain, your country needs people who can operate outside normal channels, who can accomplish objectives that official units cannot touch. Your skills and your psychological profile make you ideal for a very specific type of work." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from an exploded shell, dangerous and intoxicating. Reaper understood now why she'd been allowed to operate independently for so long, why her unauthorized missions had been tolerated rather than stopped. She'd been undergoing an extended job interview for a position she'd never applied for. "What kind of work?" Mitchell's expression remained carefully neutral. "The kind that doesn't appear in official records. The kind that protects American interests in ways that conventional military operations cannot. The kind that requires people who can disappear into legend when necessary." Reaper felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like snow on mountain peaks. Accept the offer, and she would become a permanent ghost, a weapon wielded by invisible hands against targets she might never fully understand. Decline, and she would likely face serious consequences for the unauthorized operations she'd already conducted. But there was a third option, one that Mitchell probably hadn't considered. "Colonel, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in my abilities, but I need some time to consider the implications." Mitchell nodded as if she'd expected this response. "Of course, this isn't the kind of decision that should be made hastily. Take 48 hours. After that, we'll need an answer." Reaper stood and moved toward the door, but Mitchell's voice stopped her before she could leave. "Captain, I hope you understand that certain knowledge carries certain responsibilities. Some things can't be unknown once they've been learned." The threat was subtle but clear. Reaper had seen too much, learned too much, become too valuable to simply walk away. Whatever decision she made, her life as she'd known it was over. The only question was what would replace it. She left the conference room and walked out into the harsh Afghan sunlight, squinting against the glare reflecting off concrete and dust. Around her, the base bustled with the organized chaos of military withdrawal, but her mind was focused on the mountains visible in the distance. Somewhere up there, she'd become something more than human. Now she had to decide whether to remain a legend or return to being merely mortal. The decision would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone whose lives might one day depend on the phantom sniper who appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke. The war was ending, but for Reaper, the most important battle was just beginning. In 48 hours, she would give Colonel Mitchell her answer. But first, she had some preparations to make.